Hello, friends. I'm looking over there as if that camera's not pointed down at the book. Welcome back to 1D10T Does Stuff. And I am the 1D10T in charge, Trevor Stewart 1308, as the song says. And we are going to be reading from Inflamed, the Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice by Rupa, Marya, and Patel today. We'll be reading more from that. This is what we do on Tuesdays, is we read from these books that give us context about the racism and sexism that are inherent in the medical institutions in the United States. And I know that's depressing. So pull up a nice cup of coffee and get yourself something to smoke. Today's pre-rolls brought to you by The Hidden Leaf, downtown Charlottesville, 105 West Main Street, on the downtown mall above the Brick, Suite 200. A great place to go with some great buds to get some great buds. A bud, and the only thing better than their bud is their customer service. Also, they have the lowest prices in town, according to my own personally highly biased research, by which I mean I was incredibly high when I did my biased research. Don't forget to check the website for times and events. The website is thehiddenleafcville.com. That's the Hidden Leaf, CVILLE, all one word, .com, where you can find events like Frosty Fridays, where you can find our other two sponsors, Kush Gang, purveyor of fine edibles and drinkables, and Firehouse, where there's smoke, there's Firehouse. Now, a note of disclaimer. We are covering some pretty tough subjects today, so I feel the need to say that any opinions you hear herein are the opinions of the expressor, the channel, and possibly the parent company, but do not necessarily belong to any of our sponsors, such as Hidden Leaf, Kush Gang, and Firehouse. We alone are responsible for the opinions we have. And without further ado, I suppose, we are through the ad read. Let's get into today's subject matter. I say without further ado, but I'm going to light this pre-roll. Imagine how much shorter that Shakespearean play would have been if it were much ado about nothing. Everybody just would have kept going on about their business and nobody would have paid attention to anybody. Just leaving y'all with that thought. Well, alright, so as I said at the top of the show, we are discussing, on Tuesday streams, we discuss racism and sexism inherent in the medical institutions in the United States. More specifically, I have a hypothesis, and it's probably pretty easily provable, but I'm not quite there yet. That hypothesis is that marginalized people, especially people at the intersection of intersection of black and feminine, pose a very are posed a very clear and present risk by the not just the medical institutions, but specifically by the behavioral and mental health institutions in the United States. That there is, if not an explicit I don't know how to say this exactly. That's part of why I'm doing all of this background research, is I'm not quite sure what I'm saying. I'm trying to get all the proper language. Even if there isn't an explicit danger, an explicit maliciousness, there's an implicit systemic disregard that that manifests as both negligence and that manifests as negligence and possibly active disregard for the health and well-being of black women. There's a reason I call this 1D10T does stuff and point out that I'm the idiot in charge here. It's because, I don't feel particularly qualified to be doing this. And I'm not sure that I'm smart enough to really grapple with the concepts herein. Not to grapple with the concepts, but to be able to communicate them. A lot of these ideas, a lot of these concepts are very... They're something that I've been aware of most of my life. I just feel woefully ill-equipped to try to communicate them. I ain't the smartest tool in the shed. I ain't the brightest rake in the candelabra. I ain't the smartest bulb in the menorah, if you will. Which is why we're doing all of this reading. And hopefully this will help, but I feel like I'm gonna have to do... Yeah. Even as I do this research, I realize I'm going to have to go to outside resources to help explain things to me so that I understand more fully. I'm not sure who those outside resources are yet specifically, but I'll find them. I'll figure this out. This book, Inflamed, Deep Medicine in the Anatomy of Injustice, by Rupa, Marya, and Patel, is an investigation into how the human body mirrors its outside environment, and how the environment inside the human body, the biome, is affected by the environment outside of the human body, the exposome. And how these and how these connections can be in this book. These connections are explored through the mechanism of inflammation. And there is a lot of discussion around how colonialism has affected and affects both the exposome and the biome. Yeah, something like that. I'm having a hard time really defining this book as I read it, which I think is one of the markers of why it is so helpful, because it is perspective expanding in that way. Anything that forces you to work harder to define it expands your perspective. At least I find that to be true. Yeah, we'll go with that. Expanded perspective through forced intellectual effort. We are about to start a new chapter. I believe this is actually the last chapter. Yes, this is the last chapter. Chapter 9, Deep Medicine, Making the Body Whole. Um, I do think I vaguely remember last week and the last paragraph from last week, and I think we are going to get a running start with that because I do vaguely remember it being actually the last two paragraphs, because I remember them being very helpful in sort of focusing in on what we're looking at. Um, I gotta say, sometimes in the world that we're in right now, before I get started, I want to say this, I guess. In the world that we're in right now, I feel so woefully behind in in the space of being informed. And I see this getting informed. It's important. It is very, very important to get informed. But we're also at a point. It's easy to think of us as being at some sort of inflection point where action needs to start being taken. The time for gaining context has passed, and it is time for active participation in changing the system. And so I feel like my attempts here at gaining perspective and, giving perspective are not timely. On the other hand, I think that may just be my perspective, and that there are those out there who will be getting this education at a time when this education is more timely. Or at least that's the hope. You know, it is, yeah, I'm just, I'm worried that the speed with which our society is changing is such that I myself am moving too slow. But that is that might just be generalized anxiety and insecurity. And maybe I need a greater perspective to remind me that I can only move at the speed with which I can move. And maybe while I, as an individual, will never be capable of doing enough to solve all the world's problems, that as long as I can make myself keep moving and doing something, then hopefully I'm being part of the solution and not part of the problem. I believe that's my goal, is to not be part of the problem. So that, I guess, is sort of the bit of perspective I wanted to add before we get into this. Yeah. Let me make that bigger for everyone there. There we go. And we can be healthy only when the entire community is also healthy, meaning it all begins: plants, animals, water, people, soil, and air, and the ancestors and those not yet born. And this is achievable only through social, economic, political, ecological, and cosmological spheres working in an integrated fashion for the benefit of all, where resources are distributed in ways that support vitality for all, not just for a privileged few. This vision is not wishful thinking, but is already in our midst. Indigenous knowledge systems and the people for whom this understanding is not about theoretical possibilities but part of their lived truths can show us how it's done. Once they're protected and uplifted as leaders in this movement, and once we understand that our own place in this work is to follow their lead. As we move to correct our course, we are equipped with everything we need to transform our world into one that heals. The immune system and its interconnections to the nervous and other systems is our own internal tuning device, reflecting back to us how close we are to health. If we can train our ears to listen to what our bodies are telling us, we will know what needs to be done. And when we are on the right path, it will be clear. We will no longer be inflamed. Chapter 9, Deep Medicine, Making the Body Whole. Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. But it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding. Decolonization, as we know, is a historical process. That is to say, it cannot be understood, it cannot become intelligible nor clear to itself, except in the exact measure that we can discern the movements which it is historical and movements which give it historical form and content. Decolonization is the meaning of two forces opposed to each other by their very nature, which in fact owe their originality to that sort of substantification which results from and is nourished by the situation in the colonies. Their first encounter was marked by violence, and their existence together, that is to say, the exploitation of the native by the settler, was carried on by dint of a great array of bayonets and cannons. The settler and the native are old acquaintances. In fact, the settler is right when he speaks of knowing them well, for it is a settler who's brought the native into existence and who perpetuates his existence. The settler owes the fact of his very existence, that is to say, his property, to the colonial system. Franz Fanon. There is a speech convention called Double Wampum that once served the ceremonial purpose of allowing multiple speakers to address multiple audiences. I realize that the double wampum format tends to be confusing to Westerners, to whom the monologue is constructed as natural while multilogue is dismissed as disorder. Linearity is not, however, an immutable law of discourse, but a learned cultural preference. Stepping beyond it is not hazardous to one's health. If the reader just lies down for an hour or so, the dizzy feeling will pass. She will then be able to cope with this book, her equanimity restored with the realization that the work is organized after all. Barbara A. Mann. This is not one of mine, but I'm still going to prepare the bomb for it. The coalition emerges out of your recognition that it's fucked up for you in the same way that we've already recognized that it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too. However, much more softly, you stupid motherfucker, you know? Fred Moten. Forcing me to drop 3 F-bombs in a row. You can tell by how hard I said that F that I actually enjoyed that. Deep medicine brings together several kinds of stories, each showing how illness is written on the body through histories and relationships. Rather than taking things apart to know diagnosis, deep medicine puts the pieces back together to understand and to heal what's been divided. Deep medicine puts the pieces back together to understand how and to heal what's been divided. It never separates a person or a community away from the web of relationships that confer sickness or health. It is from that place of understanding that healing actions become possible. We began this book with the story of Sheila McCarley, a woman whose suffering was so protracted that she ultimately We began this book with the story of Sheila McCarley, a woman whose suffering was so protracted that she ultimately whose suffering was so protracted that she ultimately surrendered to her body's inflammatory attack on itself. By the time she arrived at the hospital in San Francisco, she had already been in the offices and hospitals of several highly trained physicians. All had taken her medical history according to standard procedure, but it was always a selective act. What counted as a history of present illness was what medicine had already decided was relevant. Colonial medicine can't admit to a diagnosis from which colonialism itself is responsible. Dissected from her exposome, her official diagnosis couldn't possibly explain why she was so sick and why she wasn't getting better. The first time anyone asked McCarley about her childhood exposures to industrial chemicals, she'd already been in and out of ICU many times over and was just days away from her death. Her exposome included growing up in Tennessee Valley Authority's industrial effluent, drinking water pulled from that ground. Then, the Tennessee River and its toxins flowed through her, and they may well have been responsible for her death. But because her doctors didn't ask the right question, what burdens her body had carried over a lifetime, we'll never know for sure. What we do know is that she died, her immune system reacting to her exposome and her illness, trapped within the oppressive bounds of colonial medicine's alternatives. Modern medicine is a prison. Abolition is the cure. When COVID puts us all under lockdown, capitalism magnified the crisis. The SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID thrives in places of incarceration. This section is going to have a little bit of, These first few sentences have a bit of meaning to me. Uh, I, in my last week, last 3, 4 days, 4 or 5 days in jail in 2019, I heard reports coming out of the Wuhan province of China. Yeah, the Wuhan province of a SARS-like, uh, SARS-like infection, uh, respiratory infection that was spreading fast and hitting hard. Cases of it were showing up all over the world. It wasn't, virulently taking over quite yet. But I realized, I'd been in this stale air for weeks already, and I realized, like, if this was a an easily spread airborne respiratory infection, people in prisons were cooked. They were done. Like, it was not people in jails and prisons. I was in a single room with up to 99 other men at a time. There was no social distancing, no room for social distancing. And we were literally piled on top of each other. 2/3 of the room were bunk beds. It wasn't like we would get locked in a cell with one other guy, or even 3 other guys. No, we were in a single room with 97 to 99 other people, and the turnover was not the turnover was enough that, new people were coming in several times a week. Not necessarily daily, but several times a week. So there was enough turnover that any illness was going to spread quick. And the general disregard for the health of the prisoners that I witnessed in this jail was disturbing. Quite disturbing. And the thing is it's, where I was one of the nicer facilities. Like, they treated their prisoners relatively nice comparatively. So it's really, most people in incarceration during COVID survived by blessings and luck, I think. It was a system that was not designed to allow prisoners to survive pandemic circumstances. By the end of 2020, 1 in 5 prisoners in the United States were infected, and thousands were dead. The virus ravaged the Navajo Nation. Diné Bikaya, where indigenous people have been hemmed into reservations on their own ancestral lands, at times with no access to running water. It jumped species in places where bats had become enclosed as city limits expanded and felled forests. The virus moved through millions of caged Danish mink, kept in captivity to harvest their skins for coats and fake eyelashes. The state's solution, as usual, was extermination. 17 million mink were slaughtered and buried. Lacking facilities to incinerate so many corpses, farmers buried them in shallow graves where their bodies decomposed. They bloated and were pushed above ground, threatening to pollute the groundwater. COVID spread where elders were warehoused in nursing homes, where aging has become a condition to be managed rather than honored. In a San Francisco group shelter for the unhoused, 67% of residents and 17% of staff tested positive, while 30,000 hotel rooms that would have afforded safe quarters through the pandemic sat empty. In Singapore, over 50% of low-wage workers got infected. While the rest of the economy opened up, they were confined to dormitories. As the world anxiously awaited a vaccine to address the COVID pandemic, the virus kept mutating, developing new maneuvers to continue expanding its reach. Deep medicine reorganizes Deep medicine reorganizes that the virus runs rampant through spaces of incarceration, spaces that have been created through systems of domination that colonialism has entrenched. Those institutions must be liberated through the transformation of our relationships. Social, economic, ecological, and interpersonal. While we can keep engineering vaccines for the next pandemic, endless shots of mRNA may not be as effective as ensuring these viruses can't get a foothold in the first place. To prevent the next coronavirus, we must transform the very exposome that colonialism creates. Now that we've diagnosed the link between COVID and the institutions of incarceration, we have treatment options. Vaccines, masking, and social distancing are important in the short term. In the long term, however, what we prescribe is fugitivity. In his book Stolen Life, from the second volume in the Consent Not to Be a Single Being trilogy, Black anti-scholar Fred Moten explains that fugitivity is a desire for and a spirit of escape and transgression of the proper and the proposed. It's the desire for the outside, for a playing or being outside, an outlaw edge proper to the now always already improper voice or instrument. Fugitivity requires direct action to evade the structures and logic that have come with liberal settler colonialism. It calls for escaping the bounds of the state and its colonial institutions, from the hospital and the university to the prison and the military, and weaving political communities dedicated to healing together. Only then can we birth a new world. And this is why abolition is one of deep medicine's central prescriptions. In her book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, Angela Davis offers an object for meditation. Imagine a constellation of alternative strategies and institutions with the ultimate aim of removing the prison from the social and ideological landscapes of our society. This idea may seem fanciful today, But that's because a tremendous amount of resources and violence has been expended to suppress movements that have proposed such alternatives. Prison abolitionists like Angela Davis were fortified in their commitment to prison abolition through incarceration. In prison, writing If They Come in the Morning with a range of black scholars, she invited readers to imagine what it might be like to live in a world without the prison industrial complex. Activist thinkers incarcerated in movements like critical resistance used the language of abolition as a marker for the unfinished work of the 13th Amendment. Abolishing slavery in the United States and the incipient fascism that maintains it. The work of abolition remains incomplete. Racial capitalism fights back, in part by spreading the myth that prison abolition is just about opening doors to prisons and walking away. Abolition isn't a negative rejection, but a positive embrace of a better way of doing things. Abolishing prisons doesn't mean letting violence go unfettered, but rather establishing a system of justice that hold the entire community accountable for the traumas that induce such violence. Abolishing the military-industrial complex doesn't mean leaving American citizens vulnerable, but rather decreasing the rates of trauma and subsequent inflammation being perpetrated on brown and black people around the world. Abolishing the modern private corporation doesn't mean ending corporate enterprise, but rather holding it accountable to the people it serves. Abolishing private healthcare doesn't mean casting individuals out into the world alone, but rather opening the possibility of new institutions of healing that know to relieve suffering where it hurts to most. Abolishing means holding life precious. If the imaginative work of creating new worlds feels difficult and overwhelming to you, that's because it is. The world we live in makes such ideas feel wrong, abnormal, deviant, and sick. Colonialism wants you to feel powerless and alone. A paper cut feels bad because of inflammation, but the way we feel about ourselves and our world has less to do with biology than with the colonial cosmology that shapes our lives. How then do we mend what the cultural theorist Raymond Williams called the structures of feeling that tilt against a better future? The language of abolition in the United States is tightly woven with that of freedom from slavery. Harriet Tubman spoke of the work of abolition like this: I crossed the line of which I had so long been dreaming. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in the old cabin quarter with the old folks and my brothers and sisters. But to this solemn resolution I came. I was free, and they should be free also. I would make a home for them. We begin this book faulting the limits of diagnosis of medicine's narrative. Michel Foucault understood that modern medicine meant controlling the land according to colonialism's mandates. Doctors were, along with the military, the first managers of collective space. To be fugitive from colonial's carceral enclosures, then, is to move to the edge of the life you know. It is at that border, that ecotone, that a new exchange of life can happen. Abolition is a place-making activity with a geography that reaches into the soil and across trade routes, into the air and onto the internet. It is also a collective action, an act of reviewing ourselves back into symbiosis with one another and with our place. Only then might we begin to plant and tend a home for freedom, as Tubman suggested. Abolition is an activity of making a home with others. Not an individual prescription, but a social one. It feels like a lot of what we're talking about here is finding our way past these concepts of these pervasive concepts of rugged individualism and stoicism, these ideas that isolate us. Even ideas like the nuclear family. It took me a long time to realize that the nuclear family wasn't the family after the atomic age, but a family based around this nucleus. This nucleus of a family. This specific nucleus of mother, father, 2.5 children. Mother, father, son, daughter, family, pet. And this idea that this nuclear family was the ideal. That this individuality, was the American dream. And it seems to be that deep medicine is one of the things that deep medicine is the pushback against that. The decentralization of the family. The decentralization of health. Yeah. It looks like we end up with an explanation of the double wampum system. That'll be fun. Beyond the self for deep medicine. The first written documentation of meditation comes from India in 1500 BCE. In the texts, the Ven, the Ved, the Vedana, the Vedanta philosophical tradition. Before that, well apart in the Indus Valley, dating to between 5000 and 3500 BCE, depicted people sitting in meditative postures with their eyes half closed. In the Vedas, dhyana is described as the training of the mind. The Sanskrit word of the root of the word is dhi, which can be translated as imaginative vision. Meditation is common to many of the world's spiritual traditions and offers people a sense of oneness or unity, altering the perception of a separate individual identity. It is also now a multi-million dollar industry with apps, celebrity promoters, and leaderboards. Once associated with hippie conclaves such as Marya in Northern California, wellness culture has made its way into the mainstream. Corporations use meditation apps to help managers focus and to wring productivity from workers in jobs they despise. The executive Pierre Wack brought incense and meditative practices to Royal Dutch Shell offices, tapping into meditation's capacity to open up the imagination helped the company develop techniques of scenario planning that anticipated the 1973 oil shock. The global holistic health industry is itself big business, expected to be worth almost $300 billion by 2027. But in servicing the very real pathologies and anxieties experienced by the individuals navigating the modern world, the industry compounds the diseases it purports to treat. Because they monetized it, it now doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It now does the opposite of what it's supposed to do. The modern individual has been made through centuries of disconnection from the world around us, from others, and even from our own bodies. While wellness trends can help us to reconnect on some level, they incorrectly focus on the power of an individual to improve their own health while ignoring, or worse, diffusing another power. Our ability to collectively dismantle the hierarchies that cause these disconnections and consequently a large share of the illnesses that we face. Holistic medicine would be a good thing if it did what it promises, but absent an analysis of power and a historical perspective on colonial cosmology, it is shallow. Holistic physicians extol the importance of the gut and soil microbes while insisting that white supremacy is outside their field. They celebrate regenerative agriculture without contending with land theft or the ongoing genocide of indigenous people. They counsel immune self-defense without worrying about police violence. Blind to power, holism in medicine has its limits, because to practice it fully would be to indict the invariably white physician in sandals peddling indigenous knowledge and the wisdom of the East. Truly holistic health must contend with the elements that continue to make all people unwell, locating the disease-causing entities in social structures that gave misunderstandings that create them. Systems that position humans as supreme over the entire web of life, settler over indigenous, and a single religion over all other worldviews, male over female, and non-binary understanding of gender, white over every other shade of skin. These must be dismantled and composted. We must reimagine our wellness collectively, not simply as individuals or communities, but in relation to all the entities that support the possibility of healthy lives. These relationships, precisely because they are vital for health, are worthy of our care. The problem is when inclusion becomes enclosure, when the radically transformative projects, theories, and futures led by indigenous and poor people are sterilized by liberalism, when the language and other signifiers of revolution are co-opted and incorporated into some giant soup of civil rights struggles. Think tolerance and broken window policing. For those living in settler societies, the work of being in solidarity specifically with indigenous-led movements is particularly critical. The collapse of ecological, social, and bodily health is an outcome of over 600 years of cosmological warfare. Forging new forms of solidarity is not easy. It requires abandoning colonial ties and creating new relations with other fugitives. Reconnecting relations that colonialism sundered is simultaneously a personal and political project. Colonialism reproduces itself through a hegemony. Colonialism reproduces itself through a hegemony that has been widely internalized. Transcending it won't require just therapy or anti-racist book clubs or some individual process of self-scrutiny. It will involve a collective journey to new forms of exchange and relations. In their paper, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, indigenous scholar Eve Tuck and the decolonial thinker Wayne Yang argue that solidarity is an uneasy, reserved, unsettled matter that neither reconciles present grievances nor forecloses future conflicts. But it is a critical step in centering an epistemological praxis of care. I think we are going to try and power through to the end of the book. I don't believe that I am going to be doing any more highlighting as we go, in order partially to get more speedily through this, but also I feel like these last two sections are probably ones that, and in fact, this last chapter is probably just one that should be reread in its entirety, if when I revisit this book for, for purposes. um, we are, close to the end of the book. We're almost there. We've almost made it through our third book in this series. And I feel like I have gained quite a bit of knowledge and quite a bit of perspective. I'm going to save the rest of this synopsis until after we're done with this chapter, I think. I apologize for the silence there, friends. I'm just working through some thoughts. And as you know, I ain't the brightest idiot in the village. So it takes me a little while to grind through these thoughts. So this concept of double wampum that I have not heard of before. This idea that it allows them to hold a more expanded conversation with more, with more individuals. I'm interested by this idea. And, I know that with technology, we've managed to do this. This is, I'm taking part in this. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm taking part in some sort of expanded format of communication where I'm having this conversation with you, outside of the confines of a space, of a physical space where two people could, where this conversation would have happened. And, comments section is a way for that to happen, that conversation to happen back. For those of you right now watching on Twitch, we're having this conversation wherever you are, and the Twitch chat is where this conversation, how that can be communicated back. But I think that even this is a limited concept of what double wampum might have actually been. I don't know. Some kind of... I'm curious as to what this is. Double wampum. Physician, heal thyself is an old retort, and we, the authors, do not pretend that we aren't on others' lands. As the Tuscarora writer Alicia Elliott says of indigenous people, we're here in diaspora on our own lands, watching as the same exploitative process that pushed our people out centuries ago continues to push out others today. An updated version with different copyrights attached. Decolonization in medicine and anywhere else is hard. We know that too. Hearing individual stories and the outlines of power in those stories is an essential part of that practice. As we near the end of our journey in this book, we thought we might move from the mode of duet in which we have written this book to our solo voices just for a moment. Here we try to understand our experiences of diaspora through conversation with each other. I guess dialogue, I guess conversation is the sort of double wampum. Raj. I learned growing up in Britain that I was part of a diaspora, but I'm not quite sure which one. I was born in the UK, but my parents were both born in British colonies. My father in Fiji, my mother in Kenya, and their ancestors a few generations back in South Asia. My great-grandparents left their families following the trail of British theft, pulled up by the opportunities of colonial metropole, pushed by the still rippling shockwaves that the British Empire created when it brought Indians over to its footholds in Africa and the Pacific. I left Britain for similar reasons, drawn by the chances of being able to study across a range of disciplines and pushed by the racism. There was nothing unusual in being stopped and frisked, of walking home in fear of being assaulted in the waves of hacky bashing, being spat at and told to go back home. But it was clear that home wasn't India. I don't share chauvinism, Islamophobia, sexism, contempt for untouchables, or Hindu nationalism of my family there. I am, in that way, proudly a bad Indian. Wherever there seems to be an identity, there seems to be an identity politics police ready to point out my inadequacies at just the moment I'm ready to point out theirs. So now I live in Texas, the only U.S. state that has fought for slavery twice. Cheese and crackers, buddy. That's a heck of a choice. Dude. Be running from everything and you run to a place that's almost as... It's like almost as physically dangerous as Australia with extra racism and guns. Yikes. Sorry. So now I live in Texas, the only U.S. state that fought for slavery twice. Once as part of the Confederacy and once against Mexico. I live on land that's a polymbiotic set of the Alabama Cachata Cado Carrizo Crudo Coholtican Comanche Kickapoo Lipan Apache Tonkawa Isleta and Isleta del Sur Pueblo territory. I have no idea how to relate to it. If I were in the UK, the question would be different. I'd ask how all this wealth accrued through the theft of land elsewhere, through the exploitation of workers here and abroad, through the creation of diasporas throughout the empire. I'd know better how to navigate questions about land and money. I'd know who to accuse. But I wouldn't be thinking as hard about the theft of land as I do here. I turned to a friend and comrade to help me understand this feeling of being orphaned from a place because she herself had gone through it. Cadence Vallejo's family was from Texas before Texas was Texas. Their experiences with colonialism, Spanish and American and Mexican, have attenuated her connection to them to the extent that it doesn't make sense for her to identify with any specific indigenous nation. When I asked her how I ought to relate to the ground beneath my feet as someone who doesn't intend to colonize or gentrify or obliterate a history but does so anyway, she said, I believe that wherever we go, the earth is our home. I recognize that that's a dangerous statement in this stage of late capitalist colonization, because it can be misinterpreted. But on my travels, I pack a little altar prayer space kit. Whenever I arrive, I burn some of the medicines that I carry with me. I recognize the four directions because wherever I am at, the four directions are also there. I honor and am grateful to the caretakers of that particular land and to the people whose land I am on, whether or not I know their names, and I ask for their blessings and their permission to commit to being a respectful person, like I'm walking on your land. And I do my best to uphold those laws. That's actually not just something that only people of indigenous descent can do. She encouraged me to cultivate a humility and curiosity about connection in time and space, reminding me that humans share 70% of our genes with worms. And to be a sensualist in my connection with the web of life. But she also reminded me that this can't be a solo project, that it has to involve community. She leads Youth Rise Texas, a group dedicated to helping young people who have been harmed by family separation policies, deportations, and criminal justice system. Youths who have had the sweep of the border pass over them. She's a border medic. Her spiritual work is also communal as part of the Native American Church. Hey, Maddie. We are reading and finishing Inflamed, Deep Medicine, the Anatomy of Injustice by Rupa, Marya, and Patel. It is some deep and intense reading. Yeah, it's we're at the very end of the book. And right now, these two authors, these authors have written very much in tandem throughout this entire book. They've done a very good job of blending their styles. I don't even know that they have extremely different styles. We're going to find out in a moment. But here at the end, they have split their voices. They've gone solo so that we can understand a bit more about each of them. And they have this. They mentioned this concept of double wampum, which I think is conversation. And I think it means conversation in written context or in recorded context. And so that's sort of what they're going for here, I think. This entire book has been about the connections between our internal environment, the biome, all of the stuff that's going on inside of our bodies, and how that is sort of a reflection of what's going on in the world outside of our body, in the exposome, in our immediate environment. Both our physical environment and our metaphysical environment. And they've spoken a lot about colonialism and capitalism, and how, you know, colonialism and capitalism cause harm to our bodies, cause harm to our environment, cause harm to our minds. And that harm is not equally felt across the population. That harm concentrates in marginalized communities, especially in the people who suffer more colonization. Not just suffer more colonization, but the people who are colonized, even when they are out of their where they would be considered indigenous. Yes, intersectionalism. Yes, there is a lot of Tuesday streams. Our Tuesday stream in general is about intersectionality being exploited. In general, I mean, the ultimate point of Tuesday stream is to point out how much danger the specifically the mental and emotional, or mental and behavioral and emotional health institutions in the United States are a danger to black women. But to get to that, we need to look at how medical institutions in general in the U.S. Are at best ignorant of the needs of marginalized people. You know, yeah. And, you know, at best, just indifferent. It really is, you know, the more you dig into it, that indifference begins to look like the tip of an iceberg of harm. I like that. The tip of an iceberg of harm. Indifference is the tip of an iceberg of harm. I mean, I don't like that, but it is a concise way of stating what I'm sort of where my mind is at on the subject. So yeah, that's the short version of what Tuesday streams are about and what this book has been about so far. What this book has been about. We are at the very end of the book. Deep medicine, by the way, I don't know if you've been listening in long enough to hear this, but deep medicine is a very holistic approach to health, to wellness. And it's very community based. It's very much about healing the community, healing the environment, healing the exposome so that the biome can heal. Taking care of a lot of the external problems will solve a lot of the internal problems. And I'm with it. I get that. I'm down with that. This book has been structured in such a way that it challenges one's concept of a teaching text. As someone who has read this text for the express purpose of learning, it challenges me to engage with it in a new way. And I'm not sure if I can fully describe my old way of engaging with texts or this new way that I have learned, but unlearned is a very heavy, doing a lot of heavy lifting. And I'm not sure I've even learned. So, yeah, that should hopefully get you up to speed on what's going on. We were hearing from Raj here just a moment ago, talking about where he hails from. He's part of a diaspora, but his diaspora has been so... I've learned a lot. Thank you. His diaspora has been so spread out that he's not sure which diaspora he's even a part of anymore. Not just read passively, but passively learning, but recognizing the criticism and issues of those books and learning style in the first place. Thank you. Thank you. I'm trying. I maintain that I'm not the swiftest processor on the motherboard. But challenging myself to think differently, I mean, of course, for one, is a much, slows the processing speed. but also for another, it does allow for a greater possibility of learning in the future. I I I don't want to quantify intelligence nor qualify it. Uh yeah, I just I'm hoping this helps. This helps me think better. I hope this helped me brain bigger, harder, thought better. Yeah. Something like that. All right. Back to Raj Patel. Um, she's a border medic. And mimic. It's a completely different thing. Her spiritual work is also communal as part of the Native American church. The symbol of that church is a teepee. It's odd because no one in the southern United States ever used one. We're all revivalists, she explained. The church recycled a colonial representation of indi- indige- indigeni- indigenate indigeneity into a new vision. She reminded me that I've seen this before. In the international peasant movement La Via Compensia, Compen, Compensia, Sina, Campesina. Every one of its meetings begins with the burning incense and pointing to the four directions. In an entirely manufactured and nonetheless moving ceremony called La Mystica. It makes me remember that traditions can and should be invented. How it's spelled. Yeah. Traditions can and should be invented. I just worry about the people who authorize themselves to say, you're doing it wrong. You've had more engagement with traditions of diaspora and indigenous nations within the United States than I have, though, Rupa. How do you wrestle with these tensions of being a settler here? Rupa, to be in diaspora to me is to be in a state of becoming, to hold many possible futures. It is a state of being in relationship simultaneously to the ancestors of this land and to my own ancestors, to the past, present, and future, the way seeds are. For my life right now, that means working in close connection with our indigenous friends to help them achieve their stated goal of getting their land back. It is being in ceremony with them when invited. It is creating ceremonies with my family through poetic acts that can bring together our mixed lineages into a language that can transmit love of our community, honor for the caretakers of this place, and recognition of the land, air, seeds, and water that sustain us. This is my home, but this is not my homeland. I was born in occupied Ramatayesh, a Ohlone territory, in what is called Mountain View, California. My parents were immigrants from northern India who left their homelands to follow economic opportunity. My father moved first to New Mexico where he studied electrical engineering. He fell in love with the fluidity of culture there, with the mixture of Pueblo people, Mexicans, and folks from around the world. He saw how settler colonialism in North America was different from the extractive colonialism he experienced growing up amid the intense wealth disparities that still characterize post-colonial India. He used to tell me that the disparities of India were not the past of a backward nation. They were the future of places like the United States. My mother was a classically trained musician, a Beatles fanatic, and up for adventure in faraway places when she married my father at 19 years old. They moved to California and had my brothers and me there. Our family vacations when I was young consisted of us driving around the western United States, going to the beautiful national parks. When we drove through an Indian reservation, my father would often remark, "Look at what they did to these people here. Look at how they took their land. Look at how they forced them to live." Traveling through New Mexico, at any pit stop, my father insisted that I learn to talk with the people. The conversations my 8-year-old self engaged in with indigenous people, and the distress I could feel from my father when he spoke of these injustices, were the seeds of my own inquiry into why things are the way they are on this land. Growing up in the United States, I was frequently told as a child to go back where you came from. But I never felt at home in India, where I was mocked for my Americanized Hindi accent, and my tomboy attitudes didn't sit well with the entrenched patriarchy. Where I did feel at home was in the oak trees and hills above our house, where, as you walk through a canyon, grassland savanna gives way to bay groves, which transform into families of redwoods towering over banana slugs and fern-lined winding creeks. When I walked in these places, I could sense a presence here that felt out of step with the strip malls, the freeways, and the manufactured quality. Heard this call. Manufactured quality of Silicon Valley. It was a presence I recognized from my time spent in India. It felt ancient. I didn't learn about this presence in 4th grade when we were taught about California missions and the arrival of the Spanish in this land. The teachers didn't talk about the genocide of California native people. They didn't talk about the way indigenous people here had songs for every act of daily life, from harvesting acorns to building boats out of tool reeds. They didn't teach us about the diversity of cultures here. I spent my young adulthood moved by this sense of presence, trying to understand it and my relationship to it. It wasn't until I started spending more time in wilder places, in solitude with my guitar, writing music, reading more, and reaching out to indigenous people here that I began to learn through friendship and through a deep desire to understand. I felt a similar presence sleeping on the ground at the prayer camp at Standing Rock in Lakota Territory. When I was called there by California Native activists to assist with medical response as the state acted with increasing violence towards indigenous people trying to stop a petroleum pipeline from crossing their source of drinking water. Connecting to this presence wherever I am feels like a vital part of being diaspora. It can start with something as seemingly trivial as taking off my shoes and walking on the earth, to let her know you're here, as my husband says. My grandfather passed in this land. He was cremated. He was cremated here, and his ashes taken back to India. My father was also cremated here. My two sons were born here. My husband is a farmer growing our food in this land. I am a physician practicing medicine in this land. One day I asked my friend Greg Castro, who is a culture bearer for the Ramyatush Aholon tribe, if I could have his blessing and permission to practice my medicine in his homelands. To my surprise, the question asked so plainly made me cry, made his eyes well up with tears. It was a moment of tender historical correction, where humility and acknowledgement took center stage. There's a quiet and important power in this simple request for permission. It is the power of learning to be a good guest in someone else's homelands. I'm still learning. And it's something many more of us will need to learn, as more and more people are forced into migrations by climate catastrophes, and many more will become part of other diasporas. Raj, can I do X here? Is a powerful question, and one that I've not thought to ask of my practices in Texas. It's such an obvious way of being a good guest, yet to ask the question is to disrupt one of the deepest tenets of the Texas way. If you own it, you need ask no one. I'm struck in our dialogue by the importance of biography and inheritance. They are ways to emplace ourselves because we don't have a story to tell about our connection to land and people here. Those stories can get bundled up in ways that, for me, are worrying. I'm thinking of the nationalism that I see across the political spectrum, of flags being waved as signs of collective biography and patria. Part of the deep medicine of writing this book with you has been learning how to build a relationship of self, place, history that doesn't involve nationalism. I don't care for the deep green nationalists, and there are many, waving flags to England's green and pleasant lands, or the ethno-nationalists here in Texas who see the climate catastrophe as reason to kill immigrants for coming for our stuff. In our discussion, we've landed again and again on social fissures that colonial capitalism has wrought. As we experience the paroxysms of late capitalism, nationalisms become the last redoubt of those pining for the centuries of childhood that never were. Certainties of childhood that never were. I'm thinking here of national fronts in France and England, the Hindu fanatics of the Rashtriya Swaya monks Savak Sang. Savak Sang in India, where the white nationalists in Bolivia and the United States. For me, the question gets dissolved by queering boundaries. As we mentioned in our look at the movement for Black Lives and border medicine, by belonging to several nations simultaneously. I'd like to wear nation like language, speaking many and being able to move through them to see how they might combine and learn. expanding and sharing grammars and words that can't be thought of in other ways. I've heard this called two-eyed seeing, and I think we'll find our way through the fog of national certainties only by seeing with as many subaltern eyes as possible. National ambiguity is the curse and gift of diaspora. We can't just don nationhoods like hoodies. We've both had experiences in the remains of British colonialism and now find ourselves in the bellies of ongoing colonial struggle. That said, there's no pretending that we have no move to innocence to make here. As Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang put it in their important essay, our experience of colonialism doesn't render us immune to complicity in the colonial project. You've been on the front lines of that in Standing Rock. What lessons did you learn there that might help us navigate this question of collective identity and decolonization? Why's the coffee all gone? Why's the coffee always all gone? How do we understand our identities when colonial institutions have created so much of them and reinforced them on a daily basis? You have to learn to stop caring for other people and the world around you. You see it when middle-class parents teach their kids not to wander at the unhoused people, not to wonder at the unhoused people in the streets. This violent act of looking away, as my friend Lisa Tinney Gray Garcia who used to be unhoused, says, is part of recreating the system today as people walk past those who are in tent encampments on the streets of major cities without stopping to ask, "Are you okay? How can I help?" I believe that every act of looking away is a tacit agreement that things should continue as they are. That their agreement further cuts us off from our own humanity. And that agreement further cuts us off from our own humanity. Whether by the violence of conquest or the violence of seduction by power. In the end, we are all caught off from our own relationships in this system. Identity is central to the issue because the identity that feels the most whole is the most fluid, whether we are speaking collectively or even as individuals. My understandings have come from the spaces of intersection of identities, as a physician and artist, as a doctor who has been disempowered when I have been sick as a patient, as a settler on colonized land from ancestral lands that have also been colonized. As an activist who has accompanied families who have lost loved ones to police violence. As a person with a lived immigrant experience in white supremacist nations, as a partner to an incredible farmer who is in love with the soil, and as a mother who has been awed by the commonplace but also surreal experience of harboring two heartbeats in one body. All these experiences become networks of my own understanding of who I am and where I am, and it is in the transitional spaces neither here nor there that I feel the possibility of new futures, for my sense of who I am, for a collective identity. When I went to Standing Rock, I saw a glimpse of another way of being in community, which allowed us to reconnect to that pluripotency that has been broken by colonialism. I went out there with a crew of health workers from the newly formed Do No Harm Coalition. We had provided medical accompaniment to people who protesting police killings of black, brown, and indigenous people in the San Francisco Bay Area. When the police, and now we know the hired mercenaries from Tiger Swan, in the Dakota-Lakota territory, became increasingly violent towards indigenous people protecting their water by stopping the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, we were called to come help. I will never forget the drive down to the camp, passing signs on neighboring ranchers' property saying things like, "We'll shoot Indians going to Standing Rock." It was as if time were standing still and we were back in the era of colonial conquest. I had already known this conceptually, but it was there that I really understood it in every cell of my body, that colonialism is an ongoing project that reproduces itself across generations. It never stopped. For the system to continue, its power relations must be recreated every day. And that recreation occurs because individuals are coerced, voluntarily agree, or simply cannot imagine how not to participate in the rules set out before us. When we turned the corner into the camp and stopped at the checkpoint, a group of young indigenous men approached the car. They were the Akisita, the security team. The seemingly youngest wore a red baseball cap with the words, "Make America Native Again." Manna. I like it. They inspected what we were bringing in, medical supplies in our tents, and reminded us of all the rules. No firearms, no drugs, no alcohol. As I moved through the camp, meeting various Unchki grandmothers, and learning the medical lay of the land, I was also receiving a rundown of the ancient relationships and a blunt schooling on my need to abandon my settler arrogance. They were the Ochethi Sakowinj, or Seven Council Fires, which brought together Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people. I learned at the camp I was sleeping with my ear close to the ground in Dakota, Lakota homelands. The different tribes, including the Mandan, would gather at those banks of the Ni Sose River for ceremony, trading and gathering food and medicine since the beginning of time. The Lakota are made up of 7 bands who were gathered there in camp. Hunchkwafa, Oglala, Sinkangyu, Itazipko, Sihaspa, Sihasapa, Ohenupa, Minkozu. These groups have kept one fire alive together. The concept of nationhood was important, as evidenced in their customs and songs. However, what transcended nationhood was the fire, metaphoric and literal, because so many things in Lakota culture are simultaneously metaphoric and literal. Here is what the common cause. Here it was the common cause, the common value of care, and the community that was created among indigenous people from all corners of the globe who ended up spending time at Standing Rock. There was no money exchanged in the camp. We had about 2,000 people when I first arrived, and 12,000 people at its height a few months later. There were several camp kitchens, and no one went without food. A massive tent was set up for clothing, and as the winter months arrived, donations came in and people got what they needed for themselves or their families. A school was set up to educate the children in camp. Structures were built for solar power and composting toilets. Teepees were set up throughout the camp, which stood proudly while the first big windstorm battered and flattened modern camping tents. There was singing with drumming, almost all the time deep into the night. As we drove down the main path, with flags from indigenous nations around the world lining both sides, I felt as if I had slipped into another reality. When I arrived, a main medic space had been set up, and with time, a whole healing village emerged, staffed by practitioners of every imaginable persuasion. A whole team from National Nurses United was there, assisting throughout the encampment. I was impressed by the readiness of these nurses, some of whom I worked with on the hospital floors back at home. They translated their clinical experiences directly into treating mass casualties from police violence there, and to digging out people in tents who had been buried in snow from blizzards. There were frontline medics who were agile and well trained to do rapid decontamination from chemical weapons and treatment of mass occurrences of hypothermia when law enforcement sprayed people with water in sub-zero conditions at night. Those medics did a lot of the first response in the medic tent, triaging and treating minor injuries and major ones too. Indigenous midwives monitors of birth in camp and tended to reproductive and women's health issues. Herbalists kept a repository health tea available at all times, a respiratory health tea at all times, and spread concoctions as needed from the incredible apothecary on site. There were guided walks on the plains to learn to identify and forage native medicines. There were acupuncturists, massage therapists, trauma-informed psychotherapists, traditional healers, and physicians such as myself who had to learn a whole other way of working in which our views, values, and perspectives were not centered in the healthcare experience. The indigenous people who came to the healing village reported never experiencing anything like it. They had access to only Indian Health Service or the racist clinical environments in the local hospitals. They had never had a say in what kind of wellness modality would work best for what ailed them. Under the leadership of Oglala Lakota physician Sarah Jumping Eagle and ethnobotanist Linda Black Elk, medic response was dynamic and fluid, evolving to match both what was happening in the camp socially and politically, and the impact events might have on other people's bodies, minds, and spirits. It was highly responsive care. It worked so well that people who weren't staying in camp would drive up to have their medical needs taken care of. Just saying. This model of a healing village was something the Yunki saw great value in. They didn't want it to go away when the camp dissolved. They asked some of us to create something like this as a lasting tribute to the community. So we are building, under the leadership of the Lakota health workers Tasha Peltier and Angela Eagleshield, Alayana, I don't know why I saw that. Alayana Eagleshield, the mini Wiconi Clinic and Farm. Because as Lakota Elder Cadence Duchenow said, you cannot decolonize medicine. You cannot decolonize medicine without decolonizing our foods. The Unchki saw something in the camp with their imaginative vision, something that did not yet exist, but that should exist, to heal those things that are fractured and that continue to be re-injured by colonialism. Raj, I've seen and felt these moments at the World Trade Organization protest in Seattle in 1999, and at some of the Occupy encampments, at meetings of Abhalili Bis Mjondolo, in the festivals in Rio, where the infrastructure of change isn't just logistical, but the living example of the better world. In it, time feels different. It's movement time, filled with tenderness, tending, and joy. Even amid mourning and grief, without any misty romanticism, there is laughter. And what it signifies, above all, is what happens when people come together in a community that is moved by care. Rupa. Yes, I agree. I also believe there's something in these places that is generative and joyful because of this fluid community of care. I can compare it only to the feeling I get when I write a song that I know is going to move other people. Because the song feels deeply life-affirming, the feeling is one of encountering the space between what is known, this world as it is, and what is not known yet, the imagined future. And in that space, there is intense creativity, which is alive with experimentation. What if we were to relate to one another differently? At Standing Rock, in the autonomously organized indigenous territories in Chiapas, In the Antichrist collective, nosotros in Exarchie, Athens, and in the community center in Gulbai Tekra, Ahmedabad. I feel this fertile presence of the imagination, which is what makes our lives a living art form. And in all those projects, the central ethic at play was one of care. For one another, for the environment, for the foods, for the space they held, and for the future. All these elements they create around them go back and impact the body. They are changing their exposomes, retooling language, bringing back stories, symbols, and relationships that ultimately change both the nature of time and the chemistry inside their own bodies. They're building new worlds around them that their bodies will harmonize with, and that harmony sounds like good health. And here we are at the last section. A culture of care. A culture of care. We become inflamed when we are in abusive relationships with our soils, our rivers, our microbial passengers, our animal and plant relatives, our air, and each other. Our anti-imperial people's Green New Deal offers a path to healing. Dated. Through care and repair. But there has to be a shift in grammar. The verbal care about, as in I care about the suffering of indigenous people, can simply recreate colonial paternalism. Caring about a long axis of oppression and charity allows supremacies to recreate themselves surreptitiously. Part of colonialism's sleight of hand is its normalization of the capitalist political, economic, and ecological framework in which care is practiced. The economic system that allocates care as a good on the basis of ability to pay turns something inherently relational into something to be consumed, like a hamburger. COVID has shown how well different communities care for one another. Some countries in Asia have already been through SARS. Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea learned their lesson well. Within India, in Dharavi and Kerala, histories of investment of care and the faith in one another that this produces helped keep the disease under control and help communities care for long-term sick. So rather than care about, we follow Toronto's suggestion to care with. The English word care has its origins in Gothic caron, to lament, to grieve. Interesting. We don't underestimate the work of grief and emotional labor ahead. To center care in our world is to reframe liberal questions of property, who gets what, into questions of work, who does what. And in a properly decolonizing approach, who does what must be answered alongside who has had what done to them. To create a decolonizing ethic of care, to imagine futures in which injuries of colonialism can be healed, care priorities must be decided by those who have been most impacted by 600 years of carelessness. Care cannot simply be a rearranging of civil society to spread material wealth. Although the rich white men of the eco-modernist movement prophesy plenty for everyone tomorrow, the weight of evidence suggests that capitalism has broken the planet, with the richest having done far more damage than they're on track to ever clean up. Reparation and redistribution from global north to global south is sine qua non of any future. And in the driving seat must be those whose existence has been in a position of peril. The agenda cannot be set by the global north, by the medical establishment, by the non-indigenous, by whiteness. Any attempts to direct the care work from those positions of superiority leave it privy to the degrading mentality that has brought us to this moment, because its pervasiveness and its historicity, none of us are immune. The directives must come from underneath. All power, then, to the carers. Carers have been doing the work of decolonization around the world. In the nursing profession, there is a growing debate about the need to reorganize or to recognize the damage that settler colonialism has caused. Decolonizing nursing involves the difficult collective work of examining culpability, individual and social, for past injustices to repair and prevent them in the future. Concrete actions of solidarity form organizational critique of healthcare systems to radical listening for new knowledge are both new to the field of nursing and ancient wisdom. In Maori, it's the Kamori. In Hawaii, it's the Hope. In English, it's walking backwards into the future. In every case, the goal is the end of settler society. Deep medicine requires new cosmologies, one that can braid our lives with the planet and the web of life around us. The anatomy of justice stretches from the hospital to the forest, from the ocean to the school, from the prison to the sky. The process of decolonizing must be deeply unsettling and highly creative. It will transform us all. As Frantz Fanon observed, decolonization never takes place unnoticed, for it influences individuals and modifies them fundamentally. It requires engaging with material things, as in restoring sovereignty over land, water, and seeds, and securing the ability to protect them again. It requires resources to build anew. It requires recognition that there will be honest mistakes and dishonest ones. And it requires the kinds of analysis and imagination that dissolved fixed identities so we can find our way back to aspects of our humanness that center care for one another, for the earth, for our own bodies and minds, as an assemblage of organisms and systems, for all the plant and animal relatives around us, for the water. Settler ideologies have circumscribed the imagination. Perhaps the most important thing in this work is to exercise it, to escape so that those borders and limits can be erased, and people can begin to see the way forward. This is not heartbreaking. This is not a hearkening back to a time gone by, but an active envisioning of future. To decolonize in Lakota is Kilakota Ki, which means return to our own. Kilakota. Ki, return to our own. Lakota, people, the humans. To Tipizewin Tolman, the Lakota language revitalist, this translates to a return to ourselves, our true selves. And that is the radical promise of decolonizing. It is to become humble once more in the face of life's greater intelligence. It is to create a community of care that can heal what has been broken, in which we can all take part with fire in our hearts to cool our veins, our minds, our communities, and our planet, with recognition of how dependent we are on water, wind, earth, fire, and the entire web of life. It is to become human again. I don't know. I don't know that I can summarize this book any more than I have so far. Um, this has been a pretty intense one. It is definitely a mix of moving personal accounts and perspective changing explanations. Um, a lot of it is putting words to what we know in our hearts to be true. A lot of this is putting into place this these truisms about colonialism, about white supremacy, about how to proceed with care as we try to navigate, how we could proceed with care as we try to navigate upcoming difficulties and current difficulties, and maybe how to navigate with care in this world that is so antithetical to our own well-being. I find myself asking, how did we get here? But we know how we got here. We know that it was the puritanical ideas behind the prosperity gospel. We know that it was the pursuit of power and wealth over others that has put us where we are. Hi, Just Be Crystal. We know it was Calvinism and the emerging European beauty and health standards that caused. We know that one because of the first book that we read, called Fearing the Black Body. I do recommend everyone out there read that if you haven't yet. Again, I do worry, as I said at the top of the episode, I worry that I'm coming to this education late. Not that, again, a lot of this stuff is stuff I've known my whole life, and I'm looking for the language to be able to say. But I feel like at this point I am concentrating on education when maybe there could be, or I'm concentrating on this part of the education when maybe there could be something better for me to concentrate on. That it feels like the needs are all of a sudden more immediate. But I have set out on this path with this plan of talking about this and getting context for this subject. And I think I can see the importance around it to some degree, because it won't be long before we're going to be needing to address this again more. With what appears like it will be happening to the healthcare system in America, and not just that, but the social welfare systems in America are degrading as well. And because of that, the behavioral and emotional and mental health industry will be turned into an opportunity to control people again. That is my prediction. I predict that we will see, instead of wellness and health being a priority, especially in the emotional and behavioral health spheres, we will see compliance becoming a priority. Compliance was a big deal. Compliance with the law was a big deal before weed was legalized. It's a way of defining if you're addicted to weed. Is, do you do it even though you could go to jail? Even though it's illegal, do you still do it? And if you say yes, then you must be addicted. We will see more of these psych loopholes for definitions used for control. I predict. Exactly, Crystal. A CNC Music Factory once said, things that make you go, Of course, they also once said, I'm just a squirrel trying to get a nut just to get you to move your butt. So, deep philosophical thinkers or pop lyricists? Uh, yeah. My prediction is that this book is and will be considered dangerous to the power structures. My prediction is that the ideas of deep medicine that we have discussed are antithetical to the current power structures. And that the current power structures are looking to recolonize all of us. And maybe, maybe this is timely in this way. Because we are looking at an attempt at recolonization of our, specifically of our population, of the U.S. population, not just of the indigenous peoples, or of the just the black people, or the BIPOC, or the marginalized, all of Americans, all of the non-elite class. And even some of the elite class. The goal of the current administration is to recolonize them all. Violently. Huh. Maybe I did learn something. Maybe I can have a thought. Although I'm willing to bet that somebody else actually said that somewhere, and that I'm just, parroting it back. But yeah, that's what. And I think the takeaway is build community both within resistance and outside of it. That building community and strengthening our intrapersonal relationships is key to deep medicine. Being in a relationship with the environment around us is also key to this, to deep medicine. All right, friends. I feel my brain starting to grind its gears trying to understand things. As if it hasn't been doing that all episode anyway. As if it doesn't do that every episode anyway. Of course, I welcome dialogue on this. All y'all know how to get in touch with me and stuff. And if you're watching it on YouTube, there's a comment section. I don't know why I'm asking people, telling people on YouTube. Like, I don't get a lot of views on YouTube. I don't think so, Crystal, but I won't pressure you. I think you're just as smart as the rest of us. I hate to insult you like that, though. Let me see what. I don't know that we are going to leap into another book immediately next week. I think we may take some time and watch a video next week. I'm not sure what video yet, but I'm sure that I can come up with a video that'd fit. I'd say the class should take a field trip, but I haven't figured out how to do that yet, so. Well, alright, thank you everybody for joining me. Stick around for the raid. Yeah. Stick around for the raid. Let me type out our raid message here. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Just Me Crystal. Thank you, Maddie Holmes. Thank you guys very much. Thank you, all of you lurkers. Much love to the lurkers. And now is the time on the show when I say 2 up, 2 down, VA, double deuces. I'm out, y'all.
And I know you can't speak for Mueller, but maybe you have a sense of what his options would be. In the sense that I think there are people who are concerned that if the president tries to stop the investigation, what happens to all of the information that has been compiled?
Yeah, that's a good question and hard to answer in the abstract. Maybe I'll give you two answers. First, about Bob Mueller. Robert Mueller is an institutionalist who cares deeply about the institution, the rule of law, and the values at the heart of the Justice Department. And so he will do whatever he can within the law to make sure that those values are protected. Second, I don't see firing Rod Rosenstein or Robert Mueller, frankly, as effective. If the president's goal is to shut down an investigation, he would literally have to fire everyone in the Department of Justice and the FBI to accomplish that, and that's impossible because someone will replace those people and some agents will continue to work. And the good news for people about the institutions of the Department of Justice and the FBI is that they are ballast. They are incredibly difficult to change, and that's frustrating when you're a leader trying to change some aspect of the culture, but it's reassuring today. Those people do not care about partisan politics, and if 7 people are fired, the 8th person will pick up the shield and march on and do the job. So we literally have to fire everyone in those organizations to accomplish his goal.
But my understanding is that the acting director overseeing the investigation can take the final report and basically put it in his drawer and leave it there.
I guess in theory, I would think that would be very, very hard in practice, given the institutional interests of Congress. Even though they've been slow to awaken, I know people in Congress on both sides of the aisle care deeply about finding the truth. And so I think in theory, but it'd be very difficult in practice.
So President Trump has tweeted many times about you. He accused you of leaking classified information for which you should be prosecuted. On Sunday, he tweeted, "The big questions in Comey's badly reviewed book aren't answered, like how come he gave up classified information, parentheses, jail? Why did he lie to Congress, parentheses, jail?" He's saying that you should be in jail. At least that's how I interpret what he's saying. Is that dangerous when the president says that the former FBI director should be put in jail?
Yes, and think about how far the erosion of our norms has come in just a year, that's not shocking to people because he's threatened